Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter from my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story. And I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who write such complimentary messages below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, when I was 11 years old, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. In this new chapter, I tell you about our extremely tense train trip through France to Paris, chaperoned by the savage couple who fought consistently throughout the journey. Eventually, at about 6 o'clock, the little bell tinkled again, and the same maid ran up to tell me the evening meal was about to be served in the dining room, and she'd show me where it was. I followed her down to the ground floor where there was a fair-sized dining hall filled with 5 long tables, each big enough to seat 8, and at one of them 5 places were laid. The savages were seated there, and with them were 2 girls. I was introduced to Jane, a tall, dark-haired English girl, and Maria, a tiny Mexican girl with long, strangely streaked orange-reddish hair. Then Monsieur Savage explained everything to me. Apparently the 5 of us were leaving by train for Paris. No, 6 of us. Sorry, yes. For Paris the next morning, to do a cultural tour of the regular sights of that city, and we were also doing a coach tour of the Chateau of the Loire Valley. This sounded really exciting to me, and I chatted happily in French to the 4 of them as we ate. I didn't get a lot of replies. My questions were answered rather shortly by the savages, and neither of the girls said anything at all. So I too fell silent, and we finished our meal, which was far more French than Therese's lovely rib-sticking, cheesy garlic sausage and fried potato-based peasant fare, which I'd found so satisfying after a long day's skiing. This was far more haute cuisine, with lots of small dishes, like some half-cooked asparagus with a hollandaise sauce, pâté on toast points, and tiny soufflés, which were nice enough, but fiddly to eat and in really minute portions. I found this eating in silence unnerving, since at school we'd been punished severely for not making conversation, and at the enchères we all chatted away, everyone trying to outdo the other with stories of undignified falls on the slopes or successes at some test we'd been put through. After dinner and coffee, we were given our itineraries and told to go to bed early as the train left for Paris at dawn. Neither of the other girls was sleeping in my dorm, so I had a bath and repacked, leaving out the suit and coat I'd worn to fly from Durban as instructed. We were to wear our court, high-heeled shoes and stockings too. Oh no, again with the suits, stockings and suspender belts, and for a long overnight train journey. I hadn't had to wear the damn things since I'd left Rome 4 months ago, and why such uncomfortable clothes for travelling? Since Dad had left, I'd worn nothing but long black ski pants, jeans and jerseys everywhere. The following morning, we 3 girls presented ourselves in the front hall. It appeared that the other 2 had already spent a term, or possibly even longer, at the school and shared a dorm a floor above mine. Madame immediately sent me back upstairs to remove all my makeup. You may wear a little bit of discreetly coloured pink lipstick from now on, and nothing more, she told me coldly. Neither of the others wore any at all, I noticed, and were dressed in smart suits and wore proper, fashionable, navy and red, respectively, winter coats with belts, unlike this shapeless, heavy camel hair coat Mum had lent me for the trip, something she'd worn for about 30 years, I think. Neither of them said a word to me and seemed to avoid even catching my eye. I suppose I looked like trouble to them. This was the opposite to how things had been with Britta and Jonty. These 2 kept their eyes demurely on the ground and hardly spoke. I was the rebel. After trying to make conversation, I slowly came to the realization that Jane, although she'd been at Orfontanet for several terms, could hardly speak any French, nor could Maria, who'd been there even longer. This didn't make much sense to me, as the brochure for the school, which I'd brought with me from home, boasted, among many things, that all the girls who attend this exclusive boarding school will come away fluent in French and accomplished in German. I'd only been in Switzerland for a few months and spoke French fluently. What had these 2 been learning? We set off at first light, taking a taxi to the Vevey station. Madame was immaculately turned out again, this time in another designer's suit and matching stilettos and handbag. Her hair looked as if she'd slept with her neck on a block, like I'd read the Japanese geishas do, so as not to mess up their hair, as there wasn't a blonde hair out of place on her coiffure. The train trip was an overnight one, and we had quite luxurious compartments. Jane, Maria and I were sharing a 4-berth, and the Savages had their own 2-berth. The journey was exciting as we left Switzerland, passing through the spectacular French Alps on the way, and then through the vineyards and valleys of France. It was nearly spring, and everything was bursting into buds and flowers. We girls sat and looked out of the window as the glorious scenery swept by. I chatted and exclaimed excitedly at whoops. Nearly made it boo-boo there. And exclaimed excitedly at the various landmarks but had to keep to a whisper, as, since neither of the other two could understand French, I had to use English at the risk of being caught by Madame if she happened to pop her coiffured head into our compartment. I still felt extremely uneasy with my fellow travellers. They'd spent many months together at the school, but neither seemed to have much to say to the other. Maria spoke very limited and laboured English with such a strong Mexican accent that it was difficult to understand her. Jane clearly came from an English private school, but was uncommunicative and unfriendly. When the steward came through announcing dinner was to be served in the restaurant car, we joined the savages, who were already seated at a table. Monsieur stood up politely when we took our places, but Madame, who was smoking, furiously stared out of the window. She didn't greet us, and the atmosphere at the table was icy. He looked very uncomfortable as he began to translate the French menu to the girls, and it was clear that there was some sort of friction between him and his wife. She took big, frequent gulps from a large glass of wine between long drags at her cigarette, ignoring us completely. My French was fine, but I couldn't understand what the haute cuisine dishes on offer meant, so I finally settled for truites au monde, as I knew trout so well, having caught and eaten it all my life. I'm a slow eater at the best of times, and trout came on the bone, which involved my carefully having to pick the pink flesh off the tiny fine bones. But before I could put even one mouthful to my lips, Madame exploded, shoved her plate of soup away from her in a rage, and pushing her chair back from the table so violently that it fell over backwards, she stormed out of the restaurant car, her husband running after her, bleating at her in his awkward French. She stopped, turned on him and hissed something at him, which I couldn't hear, then continued back to their compartment. Eventually, Monsieur slunk back to our table. By now, we had the full attention of every other diner in the car, which was extremely embarrassing. I was mortified at being stared at in this fashion. I'd never seen adults behave like this before in my entire life. We ate our dinner in silence, the others finishing long before me, and having to wait while I picked my way delicately through my trout. As we passed their compartment on the way back to ours, I saw Monsieur Savage pleading with his wife as she puffed angrily at yet another cigarette, still glaring out of the window. Good luck there, I thought. We travelled through the night in silence, and I can't say I was looking forward to breakfast with the sparring savages. But mercifully, Madame chose to eat hers in their compartment, and so there was just the four of us, again. The atmosphere was still fraught with tension, though, and I hoped our entire 10-day trip wasn't going to be like this all the time. We were booked into a hotel that looked over the Place Vendôme, a square in the centre of Paris, located to the north of the Tuileries Gardens, and within walking distance of most of the famous landmarks. The Place Vendôme is renowned for its fashionable and deluxe hotels, such as the Ritz, now famous for being the venue from which Princess Diana left on her last tragic journey. I was given a single room, and the others shared a double, which suited me nicely, as I still hadn't been able to strike up even the most basic of conversations with the other girls. According to the itinerary, we were free to do as we wished for the remainder of that day, as we were to attend the Paris Opera that night. It was the 3rd of May, 1968, and, unbeknown to us, let alone everybody else, the day massive student and workers' riots erupted in Paris against Charles de Gaulle's government. The rioting quickly began to reach near revolutionary proportions, having begun as a series of student strikes that broke out at a number of universities and high schools in Paris, following confrontations with administrators and the police. The prominent student French-German activist Daniel Cohn-Bendit inflamed the situation to the point of such chaos that effectively the whole of Paris was a no-go area for tourists. We couldn't have picked a worse day on which to begin our cultural education on the sights of that beautiful city. Instead of strolling down boulevards and sipping coffee at pavement cafes, we spent our day huddled in our hotel, listening to the sounds of fire engines and police sirens, as well as ambulances wailing and the odd shots of tear gas discharged by the outnumbered and beleaguered French police. The opera house was close enough for us to allow us to nip over on foot. My low-heeled but unaccustomed shoes slipping and sliding on the cobblestones in an undignified way as Madame glared at me. She'd sulked and smoked through dinner, downing most of a bottle of wine on her own, and was clearly still in a vile mood. The Savages Tour Agency. The entire 10-day tour was paid for in full by our parents and included all the Savages' expenses, and probably a hefty salary as well, knowing them, had chosen and booked tickets for a Wagner opera. It was well over 2 hours of sheer purgatory, for me anyway. There were buxom women in yellow plaits, wearing helmets with cattle horns attached, wailing and beating their ample breasts. There were men who howled and fought and threw themselves off battlements. It could have been the ride of the Valkyries or something like that, but I hated it, as it took me straight back to a musical appreciation classes at school, where we'd been forced to sit still indoors on beautiful sunny days and listen to 2 hours of this torment, bored stiff and resentful at the sheer waste of a Saturday morning. It was certainly a waste of my parents' money, and succeeded in putting me off Wagner's operas for life. After hanging around our hotel for a few days, Madame's viciously bad temper was getting even worse, as each activity had to be cancelled due to the riots. But eventually, 4 days later, we took off on our coach tour of the Chateau of the Loire Valley. Even though it was May, the outside temperature was chilly, never rising above 5 degrees centigrade. And again, we were instructed to wear our suits, suspender belts and stockings, even though we'd spend most of the day sitting in a tour bus. The tour took 5 days, and we saw all the main chateaux: Amboise, Lerido, Chambord, and Chenonceau being the most memorable. It may sound blasé to say that eventually I resented being chivied on and off the very warm and comfortable coach at each stop, to spend a day freezing so much that my feet, encased as they were in thin nylon stockings and court-heeled shoes, were like lumps of ice and ached terribly, as did my calves, unused to standing around in heels on hard stone floors, while the guides droned on. To make matters worse, the chilblains which had plagued me at school had returned in the cold of the ski slopes, and apart from my fingers, I'd developed swollen and itchy earlobes. Those, as well as my horribly calloused feet, misshapen from Mum's ill-fitting ski boots, were agonizing, having to adjust to high heels in nylon stockings, and I got throbbing chilblains on all my toes. My feet were sloughing off layers of the hard, callous skin and hurt badly as I stood around or walked for hours on mainly stone, cobbled or slate surfaces in and around those castles. If only we'd been allowed to wear trousers and my lovely sheepskin-lined boots, I would have enjoyed myself so much more. But the savages insisted that we looked smart at all times. In spite of the wonders of these chateaux and the extraordinary sights we saw, the icy wind sneaking round every corner of these vast palaces in the form of draughts, I was mentally marking time until I could get back into the warmth again and ease my painfully aching legs and feet. I began to hate the whole ordeal and had struck up a mild flirtation with the good-looking driver, Michel, to pass the time. I envied him as we pulled into yet another chateau's gates, as he was able to put his feet up on the steering wheel and read Le Monde in the coziness of his nice warm bus, and I had to trail around for several hours in what felt like sub-zero temperatures after 4 people whom I now disliked intensely. That's all for today. Hope you enjoyed it. And I must thank John Muslane, now a new moderator. Congratulations, John, for helping me do these broadcasts. And I'll see you again next week with more of the savages and the other horrors of finishing school, the real finishing school. Goodbye, and thanks for listening. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Muslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week. and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.